Okay. Thank you, Amy. And a reminder, everyone, if you aren't, check your settings, and if you're not muted, mute yourself. Amy's going to try to mute everybody, but just in case, make sure you're muted. So first, happy Valentine's Day. Thank you for being with us for tonight, even though it's Valentine's Day. It was a full weekend for us because not only is today Valentine's Day, but those of you at North know my wonderful wife, Jan, yesterday was her birthday. So it's a birthday Valentine's weekend. Woohoo! It was a lot of fun. Let me go over a couple of little details first. Amy's giving you some. I'm going to try to go for not more than 30 minutes, just doing some things to pull out items from tonight's topic, Christians in the first 2 centuries or more, for questions. As you can imagine, with so many people, I despair of the possibility of getting to every question. So what we're going to try to do is 2 things. If you can, if you move your cursor over the bottom of the screen, you should see a little icon that says reactions. If you click on reactions, one of those will say raise hand. So if you'll press the raise hand button and have a question, I'll try to get to those questions. I think that I'll get a list of people in order. If not, I'll just do the best I can. If you're a little camera shy, which is okay, and you prefer to put a question in the chat, I'll be trying to monitor those too. So I'll be going back and forth a little bit and try to take questions from chat in addition to the raised hands. If you don't get your question answered in the raised hand, you can put a question in the chat, and I won't promise I'll get to it quickly, but I will try to get to those questions and write a response, in a few days. Those of you who know what's coming up with Westar know that all of the Westar staff, including me, are extremely busy right now. We're getting ready for a lot of stuff. But first, let me share the screen. While I'm doing that, let me thank North United Methodist Church. For those of you who are Westar members, this is my home church, and people ask me why I am a member of this church. My wife and I both joined before we were married 35 years ago. And I tell people that I'm a member at North Church because even though I am a Bible scholar, there are so many people of faith at North United Methodist who I look up to, who are role models. And they motivate me to become a better person than I am. And I am grateful for my church community. To the North Church family, say hello to the Westar community, many wonderful people over almost as many years. I'm just grateful to have both of these communities here tonight. It was kind of serendipitous. I want to thank Linda Hodges from the Westar staff. Those of you who know Linda know she misses nothing. She noticed that we had set this up with North Church, and she said, hey, would it be okay if we advertise this for the Westar community? And Amy and the rest of the pastoral staff said, sure, no problem. And so here we are tonight. So thank you to Amy and the North Church pastoral staff, and thank you to Westar, especially Linda Hodge. So as the Westar community knows, no event would be complete without a little preview of what's coming up, but especially for the North Church family, if you're not also a Westar member, let me briefly mention 2 things coming up very soon. One is just later this week, the 17th. Hashtag Me Too in the Bible, a tale of 2 tomorrows. And this is being done by another local Indianapolis scholar, my friend and colleague, Dr. Marty Stussy. Marty is going to be talking about two stories in the Hebrew Bible about two different women, both named Tamar. And I've always loved anything that Marty does. If you go to the weststarinstitute.org events, I've given you the link there. You'll find this. This one will cost $20, but I guarantee you it's worth it. Plus, you'll get a free recording so that if you want to see the event but can't be available the 17th, just register and you'll get the link. And next week, I'll remind you again, we have a, would like to find out, more about some of our programming. We're doing what we call a preview of our upcoming seminar on Christianity. This is the Council of Nicaea in the 4th century. That's the first of the major ecumenical councils and is the first effort to doctrinally define the tenets of the Christian faith. That's February 24th. Again, go to the Westar Institute webpage. It's free, but you do need to register. So I hope that any of you interested will check that out. Okay, let me get moving now so that we can get through this and get to your questions. I'm delighted to be talking about this book, After Jesus, Before Christianity, written by three of my good colleagues, Aaron Verncombe, Brandon Scott, and Hal Tausig. Brandon and Hal were the co-chairs of the Christianity Seminar Phase 2. They looked at the first 2 centuries of what we used to call Christian origins. And this book is their report based on, I think, 65 or so papers over about 8 years. And what we're going to try to do tonight and the next fortnight is pull out a few themes and get into them a little bit. I asked some of you, I asked you before this to try to read the first 2 chapters. Later this week, I'll send out a similar suggestion for readings for next week when we talk about the violence of Rome and the responses to it by these early Jesus groups. But tonight I want to talk about no Christians in the first 2 centuries. And I realized I need to enlarge this because I think you're not getting the full effect. There, hopefully that's a little better.
Perry, can I interrupt you?
Yes.
So I have been chatting with a couple of IT guys, and if you turn your video off, it should also help you hear Perry speak better. It will make bandwidth at on his end better. So you can still see him. He's going to keep his video on. But if you turn your video off, it will help with the sound as well.
So like that?
You don't have to turn your video off, Perry. Other people can turn their videos off.
Gotcha. Okay. Okay.
Because we really want to see your face. They don't want to see my face.
You see how bald I'm getting. Okay. All right. So thank you, everyone. Thanks for that suggestion, Amy. I hope that helps people. There we go. So this is just my title page. By the way, this image here is from a 5th century sarcophagus. I think it's been dated around 420. This is the earliest pictorial representation of Christ crucified that we have. Just a tidbit there. So, whoops, too far. So the authors of After Jesus, Before Christ, in the chapter on no Christians in the first 2 centuries, start with the Oxford English Dictionary. And here's the definition. Christian, one who believes or professes the religion of Christ, and adherent of Christianity. That's on page 12 of After Jesus, Before Christianity. And that's a perfectly fine definition. It's been around a long time, and it works for us today. But as the author's book note, it doesn't fit the followers of Jesus in the first 2 centuries. What we call Christianity is the result of, so let's look at the terms that are involved here. Most of us know that the word that we translated Christ is in Greek Christos, and Christos comes from a Hebrew word Mashiach or Messiah, and both of these terms mean anointed in the Greek and the Hebrew, usually anointed with oil. The word Christianos is the term that we usually translate Christian. That suffix IAN, Christianos, is refers to a person who belongs to another group. So we have in Mark's gospel, for example, a reference to the Herodians, and that might properly be translated those who belong to the party of Herod. So a Christianos is more properly translated a person who belongs to the party of the anointed one. When we come to Latin, the Greek term Christiano becomes in Latin Christianus. But here's the first little wrinkle. Christianus is not a translation. The word Christianus in Latin doesn't mean anything. If we wanted a word that was closer to the Hebrew and Greek anointed with oil, we'd use the Latin word unctus, which means anointed or oiled. It's, the oily one would sound pretty strange in Latin. So Christianus in Latin transliteration simply means the letters of the Greek are written in the comparable, at the very top there, what looks like an X in Latin letters is CH, and it's the same in English. So the word Christos in Latin, and it sounds a lot more like a proper name or maybe a title in Latin than the term in Greek. We'll say more about that in one of our examples a little later. So we're familiar with how words enter into a language from another and just become that new language's domain. We call those loan words. So just to have a little fun, I've given some French examples. I'll start at the bottom here. My wife and I recently enjoyed a dessert at a restaurant, crème brûlée. And when you look at the basic translation, it comes from 2 words meaning cream plus burnt. Well, you know, how many of us would order something off of the menu that was to the top example? I'm sure most of us have a pair of denim jeans. Turns out that the word denim comes from the town where the fabric was originally constructed. The town was called Nimes, and so the material came from denims in French, and that entered into English as denim. And then there's the term cul-de-sac. I used to live on a cul-de-sac. We all know what a cul-de-sac is in English, but it turns out it comes from a rather vulgar French colloquial word. I will try not to use the word, but cul means bottom or the backside of a person, plus the preposition from or of, plus bag. So a cul-de-sac in French is literally the bottom or the backside of the bag. Thank goodness we kept just the French cul-de-sac. It sounds so much nicer. My point here is that the meaning of the French, especially in that last example, doesn't transfer over into the English. And it's just taken on a new life of its own in English, which is fine, which is normal in how languages grow and evolve. But we're trying to get back to these terms and what they would have meant, what people from the first couple of centuries would have heard. We've actually got only 3 occasions in the entire New Testament where the term Christianos, one who belongs to the party of the anointed, occurs. So let's just briefly review these. The first, sequentially in the New Testament, comes from Acts chapter 11. Barnabas had found Paul, he brought him to Antioch. So it was that for an entire year, they met with the church and taught a great many people. And it was in Antioch that the disciples were first called Christianos. That's the Greek there. Or we might translate the people who were first called those who belong to the party of the anointed. Later in the book of Acts, we have this second occurrence. Paul is having a hearing of sorts before some Roman officials and before Herod Agrippa. If I remember correctly, this is the grandson of Herod the Great. And Paul has been explaining the gospel and explaining, what Paul is doing. And Agrippa says to Paul, "Are you so quickly persuading me to become a Christianos, one who belongs to the party of the anointed?" There's a subtle undertone here. Agrippa, although he's related to Judean royalty, he's a crony. He's a subordinate in the Roman Empire. And he understands that his political power is maintained only so long as he remains in the good graces of the Roman emperor. And he's not entirely sure he wants to be associated with these Christianoi. That might get him in trouble. And then the third and last comes from the letter we know as 1 Peter in chapter 4. And a brief setup. This author is writing for communities of the anointed in Asia Minor, what today would be Turkey. And it's very obvious that these communities are facing varying degrees of harassment and even some persecution. And in chapter 4, a little earlier, the author says, "Be surprised at the fiery ordeal that is already occurring among you." So as the author writes, it's going on. It's not past tense, it's present tense when he writes. And so notice this advice he gives to his readers. "If you are reviled for the name of the anointed, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory, which is the Spirit of God, is resting on you. But let none of you suffer as a murderer, a thief, a criminal, or even as a mischief maker. Yet if any of you suffers as a Christianos, one who belongs to the party of the anointed, don't consider it a disgrace, but glorify God because you bear this name." In other words, if they're going to make an example of you, make sure it's for the right reasons. Related to these 3 examples in the New Testament, I want to give you 2 from Roman writers. And both groups, the North Church community and the West Star community, have probably heard me or others cite one or both of these. The first is a letter from a guy named Pliny to the Emperor Trajan. Pliny was a Roman governor in a northern Asia Minor province. And we can date these pretty precisely to around 111, 112. This letter is fairly long, and I've only selected a few lines out of this, but Pliny's had to deal with some people who were dragged literally into his court and were accused of being Christianoi. And so he professes that he's not sure what precedents there were for this. So he explains to the emperor how he handled it and asks, did I do the right thing? So let me try to get to the major part of this. Meanwhile, in the case of those who were denounced to me as Christianoi, I have observed the following procedure. Christiani, that's the Latin plural. I interrogated these as to whether they were Christiani. Those who confessed, I interrogated a second and a third time, threatening them with punishment. In other words, he's following due process. He's giving them a chance to back out. But those who persist, I ordered executed. So if you admit to being a Christianus, singular, he's going to have you executed. A little later, he tells the emperor, an anonymous document was published containing the names of many persons. Those who denied that they had been or were Christiani, I forgot to change that, when they invoked the gods and words dictated by me, offered prayer with incense and wine to your image, which I had ordered to be brought for this purpose, together with the statues of the gods, and moreover cursed Christus, none of which those who are really Christiani, it said, can be forced to do. These I thought should be discharged. So if they could, in essence, swear allegiance to the emperor and curse this Christus figure, I judged they weren't a threat. He goes on and describes some further details and just mentions matter-of-factly that he tortured two of these people and mentions that they were both female slaves known in this community as deacons. We'll hopefully get to come back to that in a future episode. And the second example comes from just a few years later, a Roman writer named Tacitus. Tacitus wrote a history of the emperors, and in his description of Nero, he comments upon the great fire that broke out in Rome during Nero's reign. Tacitus despises Nero, and so that's kind of the undertone here. But notice he refers to a rumor that this great fire broke out because Nero deliberately said it. We've heard the old myth that Nero fiddled while Rome burned. Well, that goes all the way back to the time of Tacitus and even earlier. So in order to abolish the rumor that Nero caused the great fire, Nero falsely accused and executed with the most exquisite punishments these people called Christiani, who were infamous for their abominations. The abominator of the name Chrestus was executed as a criminal by the procurator Pontius Pilate during the reign of the Emperor Tiberius. And though repressed, destructive superstition erupted again, not only through Judea, which was the origin of this evil, but also through the city of Rome, which all that is horrible and shameful floods together and is celebrated. Therefore, those who were seized who admitted their faith, and then using the information they provided, a vast multitude were convicted, not so much for the crime of burning the city, but for hatred of the human race. And this refers to, as far as we know, the first recorded instance of a persecution of Christianoi by Roman officials in roughly the mid-60s of the first century. let me go back here. In Latin, the E and the I are often confused. And so we think Christiani and Christus are the same terms as Christiani and Christus. But it is interesting, the word Christus with an E in Latin does look like a name, the good one. It's actually a name that we find attested for a number of slaves. I hate to say it, but it's this ancient Roman notion. Oh, there's a useful slave. We'll call him Christus. But this figure that Tacitus knows as Christus was executed by Pontius Pilate during Tiberius' reign, which comports with everything else we know. And he's associated with Judea, which also comports with Jesus' story. So one of the things we see going on here, it's not as obvious with Pliny, but it's right here on the in front of us with Pliny. Judea to Rome was a place of insurrection and danger. In the 60s, there had been a major Jewish rebellion against Rome. Most of you know about this. It culminated in the deaths of thousands of Romans and thousands, many more thousands of Judeans, and ultimately the destruction of Jerusalem and its beautiful, magnificent temple. And when Pliny is writing in 116, there is a second rebellion going on in Egypt between Judean groups and Roman authorities. We know very little about it because the records are very scattered, but what little we've got is that it was very ugly. And less than 20 years after Pliny wrote, a second rebellion broke out in Judea itself. Some of you know it as the Bar Kokhba rebellion. So groups associated with Judea for some of these Romans, certainly for Tacitus, would have been big red warning signs, danger, danger. And I suspect that the term Christianoi to Pliny had something like the emotional impact that jihadist has for us today. So a group that is foreign, other, dangerous, and to be resisted and controlled and put down. So I think that the takeaway here is that the term Christianos, a person who belongs to the party of the Anointed One, was coined by people outside of the Jesus movement originally. For those of us in the Zoom room tonight who are Methodists, we kind of know what that's like. John Wesley did not invent the term Methodist. It was used by his critics of those and eventually said, that's okay, you can call us that. It was associated by Roman officials with what they considered a dangerous sect from Judea. If you look at the first instance from Acts, where we're told that the term was used in Antioch, it doesn't say that the members of the community used it for themselves. And when we see it used in the second time in Acts, it's a guy who's on the side of Rome, Herod Agrippa, who uses it for this group. And First Peter's use seems to reflect a situation very similar to the situation we see in Pliny. It's impossible to tell if they were written at the same time. I'm not going to make that case, but I think something like the situation of Pliny was going on when the author of First Peter wrote. So the term Christianos. Sorry, we're getting some feedback there. The term Christianos appears to have been coined outside of the groups that were loyal to Jesus. Eventually they would own it, and that may be something we can address later on. One of the other things at the end of the second chapter and after Jesus before Christianity, and I'll just hit this very quickly, the authors try to identify a few other these Jesus groups. Probably the most obvious is in the book of Acts, where 6 different times we have references to members of the way or the way of God. And I've given you the examples there. In 2 non-canonical works, the Acts of Paul and Thecla, which I hope we'll have a chance to see more about later, and a 2nd century document, or probably 2nd century document called the Shepherd of Hermas. They are writing for a group that they refer to in a couple of places as the enslaved of God. The New Testament letters of James and 1 Peter, again, address their letters to members in the diaspora. And we should remember that if you are a member of a diaspora, you're a migrant. So migrant might be a way that some of these groups thought of themselves. And the same letter, 1 Peter, also at one point addresses his audience as aliens. Whether that's a term that they use for themselves, where the aliens, meaning people who are not from this place, is up for debate, but it does say something about how they saw themselves, or how at least 1 Peter saw themselves. There are some other possibilities offered by the authors that I think are less likely, but I'm happy to entertain questions about that. I would just add a couple of others very quickly at the bottom, especially but not exclusively in Paul's letters. Paul refers to his audience as brothers and sisters. So familial terms are the way the members of his communities tended to think of themselves. And also from Paul, he's fond of addressing his communities as holy ones or saints. The word there in Greek you can see as hagioi. And a hagios, a person who is holy, is someone who has been set apart for something, chosen by God, set apart for God, by God for some that explains some things, that matches up with some things that I see going on in Paul. These people, from Paul's perspective, had been set apart by God for God's salvific purposes. So what's the upshot here? The authors of After Jesus, Before Christianity are engaged in a project of trying to reimagine the first 2 centuries without assuming how it would all turn out. When we assume that everything would inevitably turn out the way it did, we see the evidence from the first 2 centuries a certain way, like it's going to go in that direction. But if we resist that impulse to assume the inevitable, then we might begin to see things that we hadn't noticed before. And I think that's one of the great tome, Brandon Scott and Hal Taussig. They're asking us to re-envision, to re-see the evidence from the first 2 centuries and try to more creatively imagine the diversity and the self-descriptions of these early Jesus groups. So with that, I'll be quiet, and hopefully I've left us with some adequate time. So let me stop sharing while you raise your hands or start putting things in the chat. Okay. And I'm gonna, looks like I'm gonna have to, I've got 12 in the chat and I see 1 hand up. So I'm gonna try to go back and forth. I see a raised hand by Russ Buckby. Russ, if you can unmute yourself and ask your question, I'll try to answer that.
Sure, thank you. You know, the reference that you were quoting from one of the Roman writers talked about that they were executed because they hated the human race. And that startles me. I never came across the idea that the Romans thought the Christians hated the human race. What do we know about that, and why do they think that?
Yeah, thank you, Russ. That's a good question. And you can mute yourself so that we can kind of try to keep our communication clear. Part of this goes to the way the ancients, but the Romans in particular, viewed what we would think of as religious obligation. People were expected to participate in the services to the gods, whether they were the city gods or the gods of Rome. But if you're in the Roman Empire, especially the Roman gods, because by honoring the gods properly, you were helping to ensure the stability and prosperity of your city, your people, or most importantly, the Roman Empire. We know that many of the Jesus groups refused to participate. And as the Roman Empire, its officials, became more and more aware of these Christianoi, they used an offering to the gods, that's explicitly what Pliny does, as a litmus test. And so if from the perspective of a guy like Pliny, you won't offer a simple but proper offering to the Roman gods and the emperor, you must not care for the rest of us. You must not care enough about our city and the empire. You must be an enemy of the state. It obviously, that's a bit of a simplification, but I think that's a good starting point.
So you don't think
So
you don't think it had anything to do with the doctrinal state of the Christians, like something like the Christians thought everybody were sinners, or the Christians were condemned by God? Any doctrinal thing?
Well, we cannot eliminate, this or that adherent of Jesus going off. We do have, I'm trying to remember, we've got some examples, if I recall correctly, from the early 4th century during what's called the Great Persecution, where the Roman Empire really tried to go after these various groups in a concerted way. We do have some examples of some Christianoi going out of their way to make a scene, kicking over, pushing over, doing something to defile the statue of a Roman god or a Greek god. And that would have the comparable effect today of someone burning a flag, an American flag. Okay, so that's the closest I can cite to your example, but to your question. Russ, I'm going to have to leave it there. I'm going to go first to the chat and try to take a question from there, and then I'll come back to the raised hands. Let me see real quick. So Arthur asked this question, and okay. Referring to the book After Jesus, Before Christ, when various Jesus groups are mentioned, it omits some key groups usually listed in other studies, such as the Jerusalem church led by the quote-unquote pillars, or according to Paul, followers of Apollos. The Q people are not mentioned as such in the ancient text. Why does the book After Jesus, Before Christianity omit these groups? That's a fine question, Arthur. Since I'm not one of the authors, I can't tell you explicitly. I'm going to take my best guess. The word pillars, Paul uses that in chapter 2 of Galatians, and he uses it specifically, if I recall correctly, for Cephas, whom we think is Peter, John, and James. So the pillars is not to a group per se, but to those three individual leaders. And the followers of Apollos, yes, Apollos is one of these really fascinating characters. He's mentioned in Acts, and he's mentioned a few times in Paul's letters. He apparently was, if I can put it this way, a friendly rival in Paul's missionary efforts. they seem to have been on reasonably good terms, but some of their followers made more of a rivalry between the two than I think Paul wanted to do, at least judging from what Paul says in 1 Corinthians. But followers of Apollos, is that it is a designation of sorts, right? But it's not. Notice none of our terms comes close to being a sort of broad designation for all of us. Although the way comes a little closer than some others. That's a great question, Arthur, and that I'm going to have to leave it at that for right now. Let me see now what we've got raised hands. I'm having to scroll through a lot of different images. See one up right now, so let me see if I've got another question in the chat. Oh, okay. Well, no, we've got. Well, a lot of what's in the chat are just people making comments about audio and video. And one of the people asked a question. Russ asked a question that my presentation addressed. So I appreciate that you asked that early. So, folks, I'm open to other questions right now in the chat or raised hand. Okay, Beth, unmute yourself and ask your question, please.
Yeah, I haven't thought, well, first of all, I wanted to say thank you for letting scads of us join, because I'm not a member of the local church, but I really appreciate being included.
Like our pastors.
Secondly, I'm reading a book, Knowing Jesus by James Allison, where he discusses the whole New Testament as being sort of written from a look back on the story that happened before, and then kind of make sense out of it from the resurrection perspective, which is kind of the same thing we're talking about not doing here. So I'm just curious to know if you had anything to say about that. I find his book really fascinating and of course very different. He's talking about a much shorter time frame of looking back, but I just thought it was interesting contrast.
Yeah, thanks for your question. I'm not familiar with that book, and I don't know if it's recent or been around a while. I'll try to look it up after the program.
It's way old.
Okay.
1993, okay. I think.
Okay. Most of us would agree that, for example, the Gospels, narratives about the career of Jesus are written from a later perspective. They aren't written by people who are making notes as the event occurs. They are what we know as the canonical Gospels, are people taking at times oral traditions, in some cases written traditions, and putting them together for their own purposes a generation or two or maybe even three later. So there is this retrospective on Jesus trying to make sense of his life and career and what it means for that writer and her or his community whenever they were writing. So in that sense, that's a basic but useful point. We should remember that the writers of the canonical Gospels were written long before anything like the great councils of Christianity in the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries. So, you know, when the people involved in, for example, Nicaea, since we mentioned that earlier, were arguing about the nature of Christ and the nature of the relationship of Christ to the Father, because they're trying to figure out, is the Son equal with the Father or subordinate? And whichever way we answer that, what does that mean? Of course, they used language, they used ideas, they used phrases from various documents that by then had become at least semi-normative, like what we now know as the canonical Gospels. But they're not. But the authors themselves of what we know as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John weren't writing with a view towards won't the bishops at the Council of Nicaea find this helpful? They were writing for the late first or maybe the early second century and those specific communities. So I think that's part of what we're trying to do is appreciate the particularities of our documents. That's why I think the non-canonical materials like the Acts of Paul and Thecla or the Gospel of Mary or many, many other things is an exciting resource for reminding us that this was part of that story too. And if we put aside the 4th, 5th, 6th century configurations of what we know historically to be the creedal forms or doctrinal forms of Christianity, and just put that aside, what other options were alive and at work in the earlier period? I'm fond of telling was fond, now that I'm retired, I have to say that, telling my students at the University of Indianapolis, I can't tell you the story of early Christianity without the New Testament, but neither can I tell you as complete a story of early Christianity with only the New Testament. And we'll get into the question of the canon. I think that's our last episode in this 5-week presentation. We'll say more about that later. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
So I've got a hand up by Tom. Tom, unmute yourself and ask your question. Tom McGovern. There you
Okay.
go, Tom.
Yeah, Perry, I just wanted to comment. I appreciated seeing again in the opening chapters that you're describing the quotes from Pliny and his kind of field reports to Trajan the emperor, along with the other source, the Tacitus. I also use a quote from Tacitus from Josephus. Basically, when I'm teaching my undergraduate courses, you'll always have a couple of individuals who want to say, well, Jesus was completely made up. There's no evidence for the historical Jesus. And I actually used the quotes that you mentioned there on PowerPoints to say, well, here's some non-quote unquote Christian sources that actually give witness to the fact that there was this particular group. Long and the short of it is, it's that second part of the Pliny quote that I often use and put up on a PowerPoint. The person who is the devil's advocate to the emperor is describing what is the community of the anointed and what it is being with one another, the moral code, the sharing of love, the sharing of a meal. So it's the second part of that quote in our book, AJBC, that will make the linkages to later on chapters describing this is what the communities. I'm about to teach a course on the gospel according to John, and the community of the beloved disciples was certainly all about that type of activity.
Yeah. Thank you, Tom. I really appreciate that observation. I'm hoping to get to that second half of that letter from Pliny. I deliberately didn't go there tonight just for time's sake, but I'm hoping we can get to that in a future episode, because you're right. It's a quite lovely description, even accounting for the fact that it's written by someone who's murdering these people, right?
Yes. And he's so flabbergasted, he says, and because of that, I tortured 2 people just to get the opposite.
Yeah. So thank you for that, and that's in the book. And Tom, if you think to put the page number in the chat, maybe other people can be reminded of where to find that. Thank you. Let me go to another person here so we can do more. North Church member Ann Mackey. Ann, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, Perry. Thank you. I'm having a hard time sorting out in my head what the cause of the violence against the Judeans. Now, were the community of the anointed singled out especially for punishment because they refused to properly worship the emperor, or were they just, was it primarily that the Judeans were so rebellious, or both?
Well, it's some of both, but it kind of depends on circumstances. Let's talk about Roman policy towards the Judeans. On the one hand, the Romans thought that the Judean monotheism was strange and that the behaviors of these people were odd, but they recognized that they had been around a long time. The Judean people and their writings were ancient, and the Romans respected that. And so, although the Romans required all conquered peoples to worship the Roman gods, they carved out an exception for the Judeans. So, for example, at the temple in Jerusalem, while it still existed, the Judean priest had to offer prayers on behalf of the emperor, but they did not have to make sacrifices specifically to the emperor, okay? But the entire time that Rome was in Judea, there was great resistance. Before the great rebellion that began in 66 and ended with the destruction of Jerusalem in 70, there were numerous small and large violent episodes. To give you just one brief example, when Herod the Great died in approximately 4 before the Common Era, little rebellions broke out in all sorts of places. And the Romans had to send in fresh troops to try and put it down. And one of the places that was destroyed was a village or a town, a small town in Galilee called Sepphoris. Now, Sepphoris is never mentioned in the New Testament, but we know from various records that it was rebuilt by Herod Antipas, one of the sons of Herod the Great. And it's only like 3 miles from Nazareth. So it's quite likely that Jesus' father, Joseph, and perhaps even Jesus himself, worked there. They were laborers of a sort. The point here is that that city and several others were destroyed, and this wasn't even a major war. And so there had been these series of violent uprisings and even more violent reprisals by the Romans. But then when you get this Judean group, as the Romans saw them, remember how Pliny puts it, these Christianoi are from this superstition, as he puts it, originates in Judea. Now they're in Rome, and that's a bad thing. And so the defenders of the empire, of which Tacitus is one, he's got his knives out for them. So I wish I had a little more time, but because I want to get on to some others, I hope with that. Okay. Thank you, Ann. I'm looking. I don't see any new questions in the chat. I've got time for at least one more. Does anyone
Barry?
raise their hand? Is that
Barry?
you, Amy?
Yeah, I changed the chat so you can't see the questions that are coming in right now. They
Okay.
to me.
Do you have one that?
Yeah, so Dorothy wanted to know, does this book offer an opening to fundamentalists in thinking about their faith, or is it threatening?
It depends on the fundamentalist, right? I would be surprised if many fundamentalists read our book. Some might. We can predict that the more conservative branches of modern Christianity are not going to like the book. My colleague Linda Hodges shared the first written review in that vein with us earlier this week. But I think that the work like ours is probably not going to persuade very many fundamentalists. But if there comes a point where a person has already begun to have questions about her or his commitment to a more conservative or we might say fundamentalist faith, then Westar and some other groups offer some resources. And yeah, I know from talking to not everyone, but many in the Westar community, that's part of their background, or at least the background of some of them. Amy, we are at the top of the hour, and I think we need to maybe conclude this for this evening. As I said, I will get to Amy the reading for next week, when I believe our topic is the violence of Rome and the responses, the creative responses of these Jesus movements to that. Let me say a big thank you to Amy because this was an overwhelming job for her in a good way. So many of you joined us tonight. We're grateful to have you with us, and I've got a staff meeting tomorrow, and I'm going to be able to just coo a little bit about how well attended it was because of you. So thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing many of you again next week. Have a good rest of Valentine's Day, and we'll see you next week.